Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Gilda Ross, and I am the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I am very excited to welcome all of you here for our very first virtual GPS event. This is the 25th year of the Glenbard Parent Series. This is not how we anticipated beginning our 25th year, but I am so delighted that you are joining us. And I hope you will come back for all of the programming that we have organized for this year. It's quite a lineup. If you would like to pick up one of these brochures, you can stop in the Glenbard District office if you don't have one, or go online at glenbardgps.org so you can follow along and not miss any of the programs. Although we know this is a very difficult time and not what we had hoped for, we promise to continue to bring you important, relevant programming to assist you in these challenging times. It was to be our slogan, now in the 25th year, join us. And now it's now more than ever GPS. So I do hope you will come back and spread the word. Everyone is always welcome. There's never any registration. So tonight's program is SAT and ACT, the college admission tests under COVID-19. And leading the discussion is Dr. Matthew Pietrafetta of Academic Approach, which he founded in 2001. He currently serves as its Chief Executive Officer. He earned his master's and his PhD at Columbia University. And he today supervises the organization's instructional services, curriculum, and technology. And it's delightful that he can join us today. Appreciate that. Following Matthew's remarks, Dr. Patrick McGill, who is the Glenbard Executive Director for Teaching and Learning, Curriculum and Pathways, he will be moderating the questions to follow. Some of the questions were sent in advance. Some of them will be on the live chat. Please go there with any questions that you might have. But please do remember this. Most importantly, please check with your child's school counselor about the particulars. You know your student best. The counselor will know their situation best and best be able to advise you regarding the particulars of your student's unique situation. So with that in mind, a couple of program notes. If you go to glenbardgps.org and look at Matt's page, now it's a before. After tonight, it will be listed as an after program. There you can find the PowerPoint, you can find a brochure, you can also find some excellent videos that were generously shared by the Glenbard West school counselors. So there's some great information there, and I hope you'll check it out. We've got some excellent programming coming up in September. Lisa DeMoore is our next speaker on September 16th. Her program is titled Under Pressure, Managing Stress, Anxiety, and Parenting Under COVID-19. That will be followed by Frank Palmisani on September 26th. Frank is giving a presentation on financial aid, discovering the best college fit at the best price. And then we're going to conclude September with a truly special event with Jason Reynolds. That is our community read. Jason Reynolds is the author of Long Way Down and the author of the book Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And I hope you and your student will be able to join us for that special event. At the conclusion of the program, you will see a very brief survey in your browser asking you to evaluate the program, share some of your takeaways with us that we hope to promote. And now, without further ado, Dr. Patrick McGill, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gilda. It's really special to have our very first GPS Zoom event, so it's an exciting time. I want to first and foremost thank Matthew for being here tonight. Academic Approach has been a great partner with Glenbard High School Township, especially in this past year with the uncertainties that happened during remote learning. They quickly pivoted and gave our students a lot of virtual resources, and SAT prep converted into virtual SAT prep, even though we didn't take the SAT in April, very quickly, and they pivoted just beautifully. So I want to thank him for that. I also want to remind our seniors, our current seniors and families, that Glenbard is still currently hosting the September 23rd SAT test. This is for seniors that were juniors last year that due to the pandemic, they were not able to participate. The state did not offer the SAT when they would have normally taken it in April. And then for some of the participants that are just now joining us, I want to remind everyone that we are going to have a Q&A at the end. Some questions were sent in earlier, but during this presentation, please feel free to type some questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the conclusion of Matthew's presentation. And with that said, I want to turn it over to you, Matthew. Take us away.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And Gilda, thank you for your gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be part of the Glenbard Parent Series and to commence the year in such an unusual year to convey information. And I do want to just tip my hat to you all for what you're organizing. A lot of schools, a lot of school districts are overwhelmed, as we all are, with the changes, the challenges. And often what you see as a reaction to that is to kind of withdraw rather than lean forward and communicate. So I think it's wonderful tonight that we're trying to educate and inform. And the district is being very progressive in a lot of its programming, while peer districts and other schools are not necessarily being as forthcoming with information and with programming. So it's a credit to your school district, and I'm honored to be a partner to you all. So tonight, what I will cover is some material available in a larger document. You don't need it for this presentation, but if you'd like to download it, you can go to academicapproach.com and you can go to resources. And it's a document called Understanding College Entrance Exams, a Personalized Approach. I am going to be drawing in the PowerPoint from many pages in that document. You don't need it, but you can download it now if you like, or download it later. And I do reference some of the pages in this presentation. So that when you see page number references, it's to that document. So academicapproach.com, resources, and you can find Understanding College Entrance Exam. It's a rather large tome. I'll be concise in just pulling out some of the most relevant information from it tonight. So what I will cover in our agenda tonight is, first I'm going to deal with some myth busting, some standardized testing myths, and try to eradicate some of those first and foremost. In doing so, also throughout the presentation, I'll be speaking to some specific concerns for the class of 2021, and then some additional concerns for the class of 2022 and beyond. But first, I will speak to the I'll go through topics that will be relevant to our current seniors. And then when I go through comparison of ACT versus SAT, we'll be thinking about a lot of the juniors and sophomores who'll be making a decision between the two exams. I'll then focus on the learning opportunity that the exams present. I'll conclude with a focus on a healthy approach to standardized testing. I'll give a little bit about academic approach and leave some time for Q&A. So I'll start off with dispelling some common standardized testing myths. Number one, true or false? Test scores are the most influential factor that drives a college admissions counselor's decision to admit a student to college. Most assuredly false. It is grades and not scores that matter most. And on page 5 of the document I was referencing, there is a detail taken from NACAC, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, in 2019. And what it does is it prioritizes, the key drivers of the college admissions decision. And as you can see, unsurprisingly, the key drivers are really focused on grades and the rigor of your curriculum, what you're studying in school. So what's the moral of the story? Do not obsess about standardized tests. Never prioritize them over your GPA. That is a key driver. In an ideal world, the way we approach it at Academic Approach, by raising your scores on a standardized test, you can also in turn be developing skills that help your GPA and vice versa. So they should be kind of mutually constructive things, mutually constitutive. But first and foremost, it's about going to school every day, impressing your teachers, learning and doing a great job. So let's not academically in school, so let's not over prioritize the tests by any means. True or false, standardized testing scores are required to apply to college. Absolutely false. If you go to fairtest.org, there is a growing list of schools that are test optional. And this is where I want to speak both to the current concerns of the class of 2021 and then separate out 2022 and beyond. For this particular year, almost all schools are adopting test optional policies. And I explain this further on page 6 of the document I referenced earlier. Many colleges have shifted to test optional for class of 2021 in an effort to review applications in the most fair and flexible way. It's really a question of equity. Many students have not had a chance, as some of your students perhaps have not, to take a test because test centers have been closed. And without equal and fair access to testing, it would, colleges are feeling that it would be unfair to hold students accountable for taking them. And some students, we should not be putting students in a position where they have to choose between their health and taking a test. So I think that's why schools, and I think fairly so, taking a step back and said, look, we're going to try to look at the students holistically. And if you can't get a test done, class of 2021, doesn't mean you can't apply to so many schools and be fairly evaluated. Many of the schools that are saying this, however, it is worth noting, are saying they are doing it conditionally for 1 year. So this is why I want to have 2 different messages, class of 2021 and class of 2022. So there is no reason to believe necessarily that this test optional policy at the scale that it's at right now will continue into subsequent years. So your juniors right now, class of 2022, it would be best to be considering at least laying out a plan for when tests can be taken, because they most likely will not be as test optional this next year as they are this year. And test optional also does not mean test blind. It can be a benefit and be favorable for an application. So to my point earlier about your district being very progressive and really leaning in and doing some wonderful programming, the programming that's forthcoming is September 23rd SAT for the class of 2020 for class of 2021, rescheduled from the spring. And like I said, a lot of schools are saying, look, it's going to be a little too complicated. It's going to be a little too complicated to administer a test. And I'm hoping that the Zoom is working right now.
Yeah, Matt, I'm sharing my screen, so I believe I'm keeping up with your presentation. I apologize for the disconnect here, but
Gotcha. Everyone is hearing me, and because I'm no longer seeing all the folks on the side margin, but I'm being projected.
yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Great. So a lot of other school districts are saying, look, we're not able to get this test administered in the fall, so we're going to pull back. But your school district is making this opportunity available for students, which is wonderful. And we, in partnership, are going to be providing for seniors who might be a little bit rusty after taking the summer off, SAT refresher workshops on September 12th and 19th, an ELA workshop and a math workshop from 9 to 11 and 5 to 7 on both days. Registration links will be offered by the district later, but we wanted to, in collaboration with the district, give a primer refresher because students have been, away from these tests for a while, so they can have confidence going into the 23rd, review some of the curriculum they had studied last spring, and feel confident going into successful tests on September 23rd. A few more myths, particularly relevant to class of 2022 as they're considering, should I take the ACT or the SAT? If you apply to East Coast schools, you must take an SAT because the SAT is required. When I was growing up in the Boston area years ago, this might have been the case. It is no longer the case. Every college or university in the US accepts either the SAT or the ACT. There's no bias, no regionalism, it's your choice. So this is why later in the presentation, when I talk about choosing a test that better fits your child, the SAT or the ACT, you can do that without consequence. I've seen SATs and ACTs into every major college and university in the country without bias. It really is about what suits your child better, and it's worth taking some time to think about that. I'll talk about how to do that in a bit. Another myth, and I'll dive into the the implications of this later. But a student's test scores will always correlate perfectly to that student's GPA. It's not always the case. It's not a cause for panic. In fact, it's quite often that we see a gap between a solid GPA in the classroom and maybe a test score that's a little bit lower. It's not a reason for panic. There are some reasons why that can be the case. And the reasons are, two principal reasons are, that the tests, SAT and ACT, are summative of many years of academic material. So math, for example, is 7th through 11th grade math. You may have forgotten many of the rules and formulae from 7th and 8th grade by the time you're a high-performing, academic student in 11th grade. So you're doing really well in math class, but your math score on the ACT or SAT is surprisingly low. That may just be a matter of having forgotten some material that needs to be spiraled back. Second, the tests present that academic material in often unfamiliar ways. You may have learned how to deal with that triangle, looking at it vertically and oriented a certain way in math class, but it's quite different suddenly in the way the test presents it, and you have to get used to transferring your skills to the unfamiliar presentations of the test. Those are two things that can be mastered, however. Review of prior material and getting used to applying it in slightly unfamiliar ways in the test. We'll explore this more in the learning opportunity section. So now what I will dive into is the consideration around to ACT or SAT. And while some of the class of 2021 may have already found their tests and they're tied to it, class of 2022 and younger, you may be thinking about the process, with a wide horizon ahead of you. And you want to make some efficient decisions because, as we said, ACT or SAT will suffice. You don't need both, and one is not superior to the other. So which would you prefer? So what I'm going to take you through is a bit of a broad kind of funnel in to how these tests are similar and different, and kind of do a little bit of an empathy exercise, ask you to consider as parents how you would be impacted by these test differences. Which test would you prefer? And so when you're helping navigate your child through the choice of ACT or SAT, you'll be better informed. So at the highest level, when we're looking at both tests, they have an awful lot of similarities. We have an English section here on the ACT. We have a writing section over here. They both test grammar. We have reading over here on the SAT. We have reading over here. We have math. We have math. One conspicuous difference you may notice is this lovely little science section over here, which does not exist over on the SAT side. So that's one structural difference. ACT has a science section, SAT does not. As you drill down in, though, there is some detailed difference that could impact a student's experience. For example, SAT has a no calculator section. You can use calculator on every single math question on the ACT. That might impact a student differently. So we'll drill down and funnel in further, but I just want you to get a sense of the differences and think about how they might impact your child or you as a test taker. If you are a little calculator dependent, you enjoy your calculator when solving math, ACT may be more favorable, for example. The order of the sections can often affect a student's test taking experience considerably. For example, the SAT starts with a 65-minute reading section. Reading comes third in the SAT. You may, in the ACT. So you may prefer to, on the SAT, to get the reading out of the way first. Or you may not like the idea of diving into reading. You want to warm up and take it third. These are really student-specific experiences and perspectives, but they're valuable, and it's important to kind of understand them because one size does not fit all for students, and you want to kind of understand psychologically how this impacts them as test takers. You'll notice that on the SAT, it concludes with 2 math sections. If math is a preferred subject, you don't mind ending with math. That in fact kind of feels good. If it's a non-preferred subject and you're a little bit exhausted by the time you get there, that could affect you otherwise. And then of course, here's that science section on the ACT. It is always the 4th section. It will always end that test. If that's a preferred section for you, that's favorable. If it's non-preferred, you will always have to deal with that science as your last section before the essay on the ACT. So these structural or ordering differences can really matter for students. Ultimately, what we do is we try to administer practice at ACT and an SAT, and then put them on a concordance and say, Number one, which score is more favorable? So this is the concordance table comparing a 1600 highest score on the SAT to an ACT, and you can go down and see where you match up. And if you get a situation where one test is several rungs higher than the other, and that test is preferred by the student, that's what I call a double check. If the test features the student more favorably and the student prefers the test, well, that's a match. And what you might say then is, if I am going to do any preparation, I might invest it in my time and energy in this one test because my score was better on it than the other and I preferred it. So that comparison can be very, very useful. As we start to funnel in a little further and get side by side, section by section experiences, you can really see how these tests could have a different impact, as similar as they are, on student experience. So for example, the reading versus the reading, you'll notice one really conspicuous difference. So you've got 40 questions in 35 minutes on the ACT, and you've got 52 questions in 65 minutes. Wow, that's a lot more time, SAT. Thank you for that. So if you break it down, you have 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage and about 10 questions on the ACT. You have 13 minutes per passage and about 10 questions. That's a considerable, deal greater time on the SAT. So you have more time on the SAT to do the reading. That's important to note. However, the SAT does have some elevated rigor or greater difficulty to its questions. For example, an SAT question may ask you, like 17, to identify some information in the passage, but then it will also ask you to choose the best evidence to support your answer to the previous question. This is called the command of evidence question, unique to the SAT. The ACT does not do it. So while I may have more time on the SAT, I also have more rigor on the SAT. The ACT is faster, but the questions are a little less rigorous. So that's important. Do I need the time in order to deep dive into a passage? I'm a bit of a slower, more ponderous reader, but I'm a good reader. Or do I prefer to make kind of lightning fast decisions, say at the surface level of the text? I've always been kind of comfortable moving quickly through a task and reading. Well, ACT may be more favorable for me. Important questions to ask of your student. Now, no one would ever choose between the ACT or the SAT based on the English or the writing. Why? They're largely identical, and we'll see that in a second. Although the number of questions are far greater on the ACT side than the SAT side, the content is identical, and I'll show you right now how these work. So if you look at the SAT versus the ACT writing, they're both tests. They're copy editing or proofreading tests. They're actually very valuable. We want our students to understand how to identify and avoid run-on sentences or how to use commas and apostrophes correctly. They both test the same thing in that regard. They'll underline a portion of the sentence. They will embed an error in it. The first answer is no change. The subsequent answers are other options to revise the sentence. Same thing on the ACT. These are identical. So you don't choose between the SAT or ACT based on the English or the writing sections. They're identical. Either test that you prepare for, a healthy dose of grammar instruction is useful. Good for the soul as well, I would say, and also really good for college readiness. The math, however, is different. So in the math, we do have, as we mentioned, a no calculator section. We also have something else. We have these things called student produced responses and a no calculator section on the SAT side. It's a little bit different. ACT, all multiple choice, all calculator. So let's look at how this appears. So when you go to an ACT math section, you have multiple choice questions throughout. You can use your calculator on every single one. When you go to the SAT by comparison, well, here's a no calculator section. You see that no calculator sign. I cannot use my calculator. I am going to have to lean in, as you can see on some of these problems, to some serious algebra. And if I'm comfortable with that without relying on my calculator, I'm okay with SAT math. I am also going to have another type of question, a student-produced response or a grid-in. Well, now, I don't even have any multiple choice. I have to come up with the answer myself and grid it into bubbles without having any reference to multiple choice options to help contextualize my answer. That can be challenging. And then, of course, one of the most conspicuous differences of all, that science section. The ACT has one, the SAT does not. Now, what does it have? It has some science-ish questions across the reading, the writing and language, and the math sections, but it does not have a science section. So once again, this can sometimes be a really deciding factor for students. I prefer it, I don't prefer it, I like it at the end of my ACT or I don't. That's something worth investigating. ACT science ultimately is not science content. It is science experiments where they give you data presentations and you're asked questions on interpreting the data. It is really reading and reasoning, not science content as much. Which test features a mandatory essay? Neither. You must choose to register for the essay portion of the ACT and the SAT. It will give you the option to do the test with or without. By and large, it's better to register for the essay if you can, because some colleges still prefer to see it. It is not part of your composite score. It's a sub-score, but it's a good idea to register for it just in case. Which one values evidence-based reasoning? Both of them. They're both evidence-based essays. I'll just give you a quick view of them. The ACT essay gives you 3 perspectives on a topic. You have to analyze those perspectives, pick your own perspective, and then respond to those perspectives, either agreeing or disagreeing. It's a real persuasive essay. And the SAT essay gives a text, an author's argument, and you have to analyze the evidence, the reasoning, and the style. Very similar to essay tasks in English classrooms junior year and senior year. So with all that in mind, some big, student experience type differences between those tests. Reflect a little bit and think about which test you prefer and why, and at least this gives you some context to have, helpful, healthy discussions with your children about how they experience the tests. In the document I mentioned earlier that you can download on our website, second portion of it deals with personalized pathways of learning, choosing which test is right for you. We go through some case studies of students that may in fact have the same score on a composite level, but may present very, very, very differently. And no 2 students are the same. Our phrase at Academic Approach is tests are standardized, students are not. So in this section, we try to talk about ways to appreciate differences in student test takers and match them to the correct test. So we go through some case studies, and then we end with a decision-making guide that we actually use when making this decision, where you can go through a set of questions with a student and score them and find a winner. Which test is more favorable, the ACT or the SAT. So what I'd like to move on to is my second to last section. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the learning opportunity. There is no doubt, many reasons to be cynical about standardized testing. And some of these issues have been compounded recently in the current landscape. And I'm not an apologist for the tests. I can see that there are a number of concerns about them and objections to be made towards them. However, I do focus as an educator, and I have for 20 years, on seeing the learning opportunity. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And this goes back to a point we made earlier. Sometimes that GPA doesn't really correlate with the test scores. Why? Well, it's an interesting thing, but sometimes a great student doesn't equal a great test taker. Why? We said earlier, because these tests are really summative. They cover a lot of material. And this most important point here, they test skills in a challenging, unfamiliar way under time pressure. And to appreciate this, there's a great anecdote to understand what's required to be effective at test taking, particularly with rigorous tests. And it comes from a physics class from a physics teacher who taught students in the physics class a particular example during the course of the semester, and it was this. A ball weighing 3 kilograms is dropped from the top of a 100-meter tower. How many seconds does it take to reach the ground? Taught the students the effect of gravity on a falling object within the Earth's atmosphere, gave them the formula, thought they understood it during the semester, gave them this problem on the final exam. There's a 100-meter hole in the ground, not a tower this time, but a hole. Ball weighing 3 kilograms, same weight as the example ball from the course work they did during the semester. It's rolled off the side into a hole. How long does it take to reach the bottom? Physics teacher thought for sure my students will get this one because I prepared them well. Well, not the case. The students complained, hey, that test wasn't fair, teacher. We never had any hole problems. And what this really shows is a concept in education called transfer, and sometimes the failure to transfer. Basically, learning a skill on a deep level, you want to learn it to the extent that you can apply it to multiple contexts, even unfamiliar ones. But the ability to do that is not always apparent or readily available for students. It's not always easy to acquire. These students, when they saw hole versus tower, thought it was a totally different concept, rather than understand the underlying concept of the impact of gravity on a falling object within the Earth's atmosphere. And so the deeper concept was not understood, therefore the cosmetics, tower, hole, confused the students and put them off. So the story indicates that transfer is not always immediate or easy. And this is, yes, theoretical, but it's also really practical. We hear it with our students all the time. He gets A's in class, but a horrible test taker. She knows most of her stuff and has skills, but when she sees something new, she freaks out. I never saw problems like this on the test before. The test was impossible. I hear that all is symptomatic of students just needing to better learn how to transfer their skills. And it takes a while. You have to develop a skill deeply and learn to apply it in multiple settings. And that's really the challenge that standardized tests present. And the test writers do a very good job of taking core curriculum that our students should know and graduating it to different levels of rigor to make it hard to transfer the skill and be successful. So the challenge of transfer quickly, and I have parents together, I have to give you a quiz. It's only fair for you to empathize with your students. But this little quiz, I'll walk through it quickly, will illustrate the challenge of transfer to you in terms of how tests are built and how items are developed. And you'll understand your students' experience with test taking a little bit more as a result. So I'm going to show you a few items, 3 English, 3 math, from an officially released ACT. We've given it to thousands of students and aggregated the data on their performance. These are all items from the same test, from the same sample testing population. So the first item here is a grammar item testing sentence construction. We've got a problem. We've got the dreaded, the wicked, the evil, comma spliced run-on. There's only one fix for it. Comma but, comma fanboys, forehand nor but or yet so, many students know. And so this is testing sentence construction, fixing run-on sentences. You can get at this another way too, though, through the logic, because but makes most sense logically in the context of this sentence. So we gave it to thousands of students, aggregated the data, and of the students who took it, 60% were accurate. Same test, same testing population, you go on to another item. This is also testing sentence construction within the same test. The sentence now is a little bit longer though. Trying to understand how these two clauses connect becomes a little trickier. It's easier to miss this subordinating conjunction back here though, and to forget that it's a dependent clause, and so the comma connecting to an independent clause is just fine. If you know a thing or two about your grammar, you would know that semicolon and a period and a comma, fanboys, and are kind of all the same. They connect to independent clauses. Test probably wouldn't make you choose among those, so you might get rid of all those. But things are getting longer. Now you're throwing semicolons at me. Same students, same test. And they drop to 24% accuracy from 60% accuracy. One would argue that if you knew your sentence construction skills well, though, you should be able to transfer it onto that item and do a little bit, keep a little closer to the 60% that you had on the previous item. Same test, same testing population. Another sentence, oh boy, now they're throwing some dashes in. There's a colon here, still sentence construction, still thinking about ways to connect independent and dependent clauses using correct grammar. That's the proper use of a colon, independent clause to the left. The right answer is a question the independent clause raises. So that's correct. If you understand your use of a colon, you feel comfortable there. But now we've got a longer sentence, we've got dashes, we've got colons. The test is really making it difficult. And sure enough, we drop now to 17% accuracy. Same test, same testing population. So what we're seeing here is the test writers are creating material at graduated levels of rigor, and accuracy is dropping. So part of the goal of developing skills with students is to help them take a skill and graduate it up to those different levels of rigor and transfer their skills onto increasingly challenging material. Briefly, I'll show you, so I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Just I'll give you 2 examples out of the 3 of the math. The first item, it is dealing with basic triangle area. So we have a 5 by 6 rectangle, cut in half. We're going to have a triangle. If you know a thing or two about your area formulas, it's 1/2 base times height. So 1/2 30, it's going to be 15. We feel pretty good about that. Most students have learned that in their geometry classes. And so we have about 50% of the students are successful, 48% accurate. That's knowing triangle area and applying it. Now, we move on in the same test, same testing population, and oh gosh, now they're using the word rhombus, and they want to know the area of this rhombus. Well, that could terrify me. That word is kind of scary. However, if I thought about my triangle rules, which I knew before for the previous problem, at least half of the students did, and AC is 10, and D and BD is 12, well, I could kind of think of this whole thing as a rectangle, 10 by 12 rectangle, it's 120. Triangles are half of the area inside, it's going to be 60. It's rhombus, it's a little scary, but I know triangles. I'm applying my triangle knowledge and transferring it to new items, and I should be able to do this. But same, student testing population, same test, that 48% is cut in half. And the third item is yet another, it's a triangular prism, looks a little scarier still. If you are able to understand it's the area of this triangle, and if I want volume, well, I'll probably multiply it by that dimension here. You should be able to be reasonably successful with your basic triangle knowledge and transfer it. But once again, we're down now to 17%. So my point in these items is the opportunity, the learning opportunity with standardized testing is to study items at the right level of rigor, to push your ability as a student to apply skills to unfamiliar, novel problem-solving contexts. And in life, what do we want from our students as problem solvers? We want them to be flexible. We want them to be able to apply problem solving like we do as professionals in new work environments and new contexts. I think the opportunity here of getting students to take on rigorous tasks and push themselves to apply skills at higher levels of rigor consistently is, also could be measured not only in higher test scores or GPA, but also access to more rigorous college programming and even better graduation rates, as the research shows if you go to collegeresults.org. So challenging our students with rigorous tasks and helping them be successful is incredibly important. The tests, we can throw a variety of stones at them, but they are a means to that end. They're an opportunity to engage students with complex material and help them achieve academic mastery. In terms of this concept of promoting rigor, I recently wrote an op-ed piece in Inside Higher Ed called Standardized Tests Can Promote Rigor, in which I pulled a lot of research on this and how tests can be used to produce higher achievement in students, kind of put a positive gravitational pull on learning for students. So if we can look at standardized testing, not often, if it is something your students are undertaking, if we can kind of take that lens of negativity off of it and see it more as part of their educational experience and a positive opportunity to learn and expand their skills, that is a positive way to approach this situation. And I'll end then with, a healthy approach to standardized testing. There are a lot of tests and it can cause a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety. The acronyms alone can get confusing. Earlier in my presentation was flipping ACT and SAT as I commonly do, and you all probably do as well. So, navigating all that confusion in a healthy way, what do? I think there are just a few key principles to bear in mind. You have an amazing school district with great counseling staff. So listen first and foremost to your college counseling team. In the Q&A, I will answer what I can at a high level, but I'm going to direct you all to your college counseling team for really good, nuanced, professional advice. Not all school districts have such resources and supports. You do, so it's a wonderful to take advantage of it. Like I said in the beginning, academic success first and foremost before standardized testing. If necessary, supplement with test preparation. If you can, personalize your analysis of practice test scores. This can help because then if you do have a chance to pick between ACT and SAT and you can make the better choice, that could save some time. It could be less frustrating for a student because they're matched with the better test. One-on-one and classroom course instruction from Academic Approach and a variety of companies is available to provide curricular support. And we are, once again, very thrilled to be a partner with the district to provide classroom course instruction. We're looking forward to the refresher workshops in a couple weeks as well for the seniors. So once again, kind of recapping some of the next steps. You all, for the class of 2021, you have that SAT on the 23rd. You've got some refresher workshops on the 12th and 19th, which you'll learn more about registering for soon. I'm going to be introducing those, so I'll be looking forward to being a part of those with you all. And then just before we go to Q&A, just a couple final notes about Academic Approach. As Gilda was kind enough to introduce me generously. She hit on a lot of these points. I founded Academic Approach in 2001. We have offices around Chicagoland, and we're really focused on skills-based test preparation, academically enriching test preparation for the ACT and SAT, as well as academic tutoring support. We're really proud to support our students and our district partners. We value being welcomed into this series and being welcomed into be flexible, collaborative partners. Just 3 principles that kind of guide us, that you heard some of the themes tonight in my presentation. Tests are standardized, students are not. One size does not fit all, so it is worth really trying to look into the data and figure out what it is saying about the individual needs of your child and try to incorporate that into a larger understanding of the student's academic development. Skills-based test preparation, let's move beyond tips and tricks. When in doubt, pick C. You're not going to really hear that from us. We're going to focus more, as we did in the quiz, on some of the underlying skills. We're really trying to develop a depth of knowledge of those skills. And it's really what we call teaching beyond the test. So with that, I want to thank you all and open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
I really like the transfer aspect. It's something we deal with in the classroom all the time. And to see that being applied to testing was unique, but it's so true. Like transferring those skills is so important. We have a lot of questions flooding in now, which is great. I'll address one right off the bat. The SAT at Glenbard does include the essay. So that is offered. The one question for you, Matthew, will it hurt a child if they take both the ACT and the SAT?
Great question. Thank you for that, Patrick. No, because most schools, almost all, have a policy called score choice, where you can submit whatever scores you want to the school. It really is your own personal property, your score record. You don't, so for example, let's say you preferred your ACT score, but you did take, an SAT. You don't have to send that SAT score to colleges. You can send your ACT score. What's more, score choice allows you to sit for a test a couple times. You could take a couple shots at the ACT or the SAT. Your, June test was better than your April test, for example. So you just choose to send your June test to colleges without reporting your April test. I will defer to some nuance, a little bit of nuance to your college counseling team. There are a small number of schools that have a full disclosure policy. They just want to know, they want you to, on an honor policy basis, say, how many times did you take the test? You can still send us your highest score, but we do want to know how many times you took it. So I think this is a fair check on abuse. As a brief anecdote, when I first started tutoring. I do remember, it was 20 years ago, hearing from a parent saying, bringing a junior to me and saying, okay, I want to start, SAT preparation. And I said, okay, great. I'd like to give a practice test so we could see where the student is. And the mom said, oh, we know exactly where the student is. We have lots of SATs the student has taken. In fact, the student's been taking them, every single one, on every official test date since 8th grade. And I said, oh gosh, that's a bit excessive. This student will probably hate me and never want to deal with the SAT because they've been over-tested. So I think full disclosure policy by a few schools has been just to, check against abuse like that. We don't want students taking a million official tests. But to go in and take 2 or 3 is very common. And to submit your best score is very common. Run that by a college counseling team. I always defer to them, but that tends to be, in general, common practice. Take it a couple times, submit your best score using score choice.
Here's the next question. How many schools accept super scoring for ACT in 2021 applications given COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question. The list of schools that have been accepting super scores has been growing. And we have a link to the list of schools on our website that is a follow-up. I will pull that particular link and maybe it can be shared so you can look at it. The list has been growing. I don't know yet of COVID specific changes to that policy, but that trend for schools just to say, look, you can super score. That is basically, for those who don't understand super scoring, you can, I was just explaining previously, sending from one test administration your best score. So you took it in April, you took it in June, didn't like April, you just sent June. Super scoring is different. Super scoring would be, I'll use an SAT as an example because most schools super score the SAT. So let's say you did get a chance to take the SAT last spring and then you take the September 23rd. In the spring, you did pretty well on the math, felt really good about that. Didn't have your best day on the evidence-based reading and writing. You go back in on the September 23rd test and you drop a little bit in the math, but boy, did that evidence-based reading and writing surge. So you send both scores, the spring and September 23rd, and the school will super score those scores. That is, they will take your great math from the spring, match it with your great evidence-based reading and writing from September 23rd, and that's your super score. In that case, it is quite favorable to take the test twice. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. If one score goes up and the other goes down, as long as it's not a dramatic drop, because you do have to send both scores, then that can be really favorable. Now that has been an SAT policy. Most schools super scoring the SAT. It is a more recent phenomenon for the ACT to get super scored. And a growing list of schools are doing that. I'm not aware of any particular surge in adopting that policy because of COVID, but I will follow up with a link to a list of colleges that do super score ACT scores as well as SAT scores.
There's a few quick ones I want to address, Matthew, that are coming in. When will the class of 2022 take the SAT? So they're scheduled currently to take it in April, offered through Glenbard, but as a part of the Illinois State Board of Education graduation requirement. Also, there's some questions. If my student took the ACT separately, do they still need to take the in-school SAT? So currently, according to ISB guidance, the SAT, the in-school SAT is still a graduation requirement for our current seniors. And so if at all possible, we encourage our students to take it. In general, it benefits students to take it. If they don't already have a score, the September test date really benefits students because theoretically you'll have those scores in time for all your college applications, as well as some early decision deadlines. Matthew, here's a question for you. Do you know how schools are going to deal with merit scholarships in a test optional environment, as these test scores are often considered for scholarships?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's a question that we've been asking about schools that have moved test to test optional policies, period. are, you know, and when you dig in, it's a really school by school, you know, I think decision or policy. But yes, you can have a school that is test optional that is still using standardized tests for merit scholarships and for college credits or distributional requirements and so forth. So this is why I think it is important to drill down into these questions with your capable college counseling team, school by school, policy by policy. But also I think at the highest level, this is why it's important not to see test optional as test blind, or that this means that tests do not matter for anything. We do not want students having to be anxious about tests if they cannot take them, or it is not healthy for them to take them. But we don't want to underestimate, case in point, scholarships and placements out of distributional requirements and so forth, that these tests can be, they have a history of being used for predictive purposes by colleges to predict how a student will do in college curriculum. And that's where a lot of the research from ACT and SAT has been focused over the years, to do those longitudinal studies. So these could be good instruments for predicting college success. So we don't want to underestimate their value as still being part of those sorts of decisions. But once again, I would say that's my high level answer. I defer to your college counseling team and a school by school kind of policy review.
I got a few of the same question. You do not need to sign up for the SAT on September 23rd. Every student in Glenbard is automatically signed up, so that you're already enrolled, and there's nothing that you need to do as a parent or a student. Interesting question, Matthew. I don't know if you know the answer to this. Can students still super score after their applications have been submitted?
I would presume if I understand the question right, if the application, the way I understand the process, is in order for the application to be submitted fully, if the school was looking for standardized tests as part of that application, you would have already submitted them. So I'm not sure I understand what after the fact of application would mean, because I would think the application would involve the submission of scores. But I might be missing some of the nuance of that question.
You addressed this a little bit earlier, but I had a email question. Do you think that the test optional that is a lot of schools are doing for seniors right now that are applying to college, do you think that's going to stick in the future?
It's a great question. And I think that there has been a growing trend towards test optional year over year anyway. I would imagine that there will be many schools that will not go back from this. They will stay with test optional. Many of the policies, however, that have been, if you go to the college websites and see the statements, they are very, very careful in many cases to specify that this is a 1-year policy subject to review, but they did not say that the entire process forever and a day is going test optional. But for this year, out of consideration of the unique challenges the class of 2021 is going through, they're doing it, but only adapting it for a year. So when planning for juniors right now, 2022 and beyond, I do not think it is, you're going to have a state mandated test in the spring, as Patrick said. And I would go back to business as usual. If you're thinking about most schools that if they're on your list or growing list, and they're saying we are test optional for a year, I would think there's a high probability they come off of that and go back to requiring or strongly recommending tests.
And then can you take ACT and or the SAT and decide not to represent the score to colleges, or do colleges see that automatically?
Yeah, that's a great question. That goes back to that discussion of score choice. So it's good to really understand the process. The process is when you register for a national test date, the parent registers and you pay your registration fee and you go to a test center and the student takes the test and the score is reported and it goes to the student. It does not, unless you, when registering, choose to send the score, and both companies will allow you to send scores to 5 schools for free, colleges. If you put in the school codes upon registration, then that score does get issued to those schools. But if you do not put in the school codes, which is always best practice not to, because you don't know what the results are going to be, you might as well just send it later. Then that score is just coming to you. And it's, like I said earlier, it's your property. And in the college counseling process with your college counselors, you say, well, I happen to take an ACT, I took an SAT, here are the scores, which you think is more favorable. You'll get some advice. And then you choose later and you have to pay for this. I'm applying to these 10 schools. I would like to send this score from ACT or SAT to these 10 schools. And those companies do charge you to send your transcript to those 10 schools. But that's the only way that it gets there, because it's your property. Unless, of course, as I said, when registering and the prompt comes up, would you like to send your scores without knowing what they are, because you haven't taken the test yet, to 5 schools for free, and you start putting in school codes, well, then it is going to be released. But it is best practice not to fill that out until you know that this is something that you want to share, and then share it later in the process.
There's an interesting question that I want to address from Andrea. She says, do you find that a student whose SAT scores are at the lower end of the university's average will struggle there? Even if they are admitted, how likely is success there? And I want to take this one on because there's sometimes a belief, and I'm sure you see this too, Matthew, where students and families maybe think, if I'm overqualified for a school, maybe it'll be easier for me there. But when you look at the data in general, the schools that are maybe a reach school that are tougher for a student to get accepted into, those schools generally have a higher graduation rates. Now, of course, that's a broad generalization, but is that something that you would agree with too, that you've seen in your practice?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We were talking about this the other day, Patrick. I think that's a great point.
And then we're running up right to the clock. Before I hand it off to Gilda to close this out, I just want to say thank you for everything that you and your organization is doing for Glenbard, but taking the time tonight to really dive into the SAT and the ACT. I really liked what you said when you said tests are standardized and students are not. And I just want to underscore throughout all of this, it's really important that families and students take the time to meet with their counselor one-on-one and really painstakingly go through all these questions. There's a lot of things to consider. It's not all about GPA and SAT. It's also about the fit for the school and the student and the major. There's a lot of things to consider. So please make sure you take the time to meet with your counselor, to painstakingly go through all the information. These are some of the most important decisions that students and families are making. So you want to make sure that you're doing that with our wonderful Glenbard counselors and you're taking the time to make that decision right. So with that said, Matthew, do you have any closing comments for us before we hand it over to Gilda? Any words of advice, wisdom?
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity. I think that in a year of such uncertainty, the best and really only approach is to get ahead of things with information and communication. And so I want to applaud you both for the series, for the effort, for getting out ahead of this, because there's I think it's a great service to families to try to educate at a time when there's a lot of information out there. So it's a great service you're doing. So I want to thank you all for doing it, and I just want to encourage parents to see themselves as part of compared to a lot of districts I work with, a very progressive effort here to share information, to counsel, and to get out ahead of all these topics. So thank you all for including me in it.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Patrick. This is a challenging time for all of us. And I do hope that with the answers to these questions and Matthew's presentation, we did relieve some of your stress. Colleges are understanding about these issues. I like the way, Matthew, you said, check with your nuanced professional school counselor, because they will know the particulars about your case, and the colleges, of course. These things do vary so much case by case. So it's really, really important to get educated and be proactive about that. And again, I do hope this evening was useful for you. Also useful for you will be to go to Matt's page at glenbardgps.org. After tonight, it will become a past event, but that's where you can find his brochure, his PowerPoint, and also some very excellent videos that were shared by the school counselors, as I mentioned, at Glenbard West. You can see that right there at the bottom of the page. I just watched them this afternoon, and I think they'll answer even more questions. And finally, thank you for sticking with us on our first virtual event here. 3 more coming up this month. Lisa DeMoore on September 16th on stress under COVID, and Frank Palmasani on September 26th, Saturday morning, on financial aid, and this special event with Jason Reynolds, stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, and Long Way Down. Thank you, everyone, and please come back and share the resource that is GPS. We're here, we're gonna do this together. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.